from a defabricated solar-powered garden shed in Rockland County, New York, USA. This is Stand Up with Pete Dominick. On today's episode, how to lighten up the mood at the museum when you're checking out that totally jacked Neanderthal. And now, the podcast host who has no problem with Neanderthals because he loves him some genealogy, Pete Dominick.
Yes, that's right. It's like Pete Coe is part of my family because, as he does know, I took them. We went to the Museum of Natural History in New York City on Sunday. Great family day in the city. Had a lot of fun. Teased Julia a lot that every time we went to a different dinosaur or Neanderthal, however you pronounce that woman, I said, oh, she looks a little bit like you. She's got your nose. And we had plenty of laughs and a great time. Brunch. It was a great family day in the city. Got home late, so I don't have a huge opening for you, but I do have an amazing interview with Dr. Kidada Williams of Wayne State University, who has written a fascinating, super important new history book, which could not be more relevant for a lot of sad reasons. It's called I Saw Death Coming, a history of terror and survival in the war against Reconstruction. And it talks about the terrorism done to black folks and families and former slaves during Reconstruction, and it's so good. She's so good. We had a really great conversation, and I say timely because we're seeing more news of an unarmed black man, Tyre Nichols in this case, in Memphis, Tennessee. You've heard and I'm sure read or paid attention to different aspects of that horrible case. I refused this time. I always watch the videos. This one I was like, I just can't. I tried watching it and I just turned it off, and I see the headlines here, and I'll mention a couple of those, but just a great conversation with Dr. Kidada Williams. Professor Williams was really, really cool. The book is so good. I've been reading it, and I'm really proud that we were able to sit down and have this conversation on today's podcast. We're learning a lot from our guests lately. I'm always trying to do that here, trying to get the smartest people that we can find to sit down and talk with me. I've got a lot of new guests coming up. If you didn't hear my conversation with Eric Siegel that I posted over the weekend, I highly recommend it. Lots of amazing feedback on that, talking about death and dying with dignity or a lack thereof. So many people relating to it and reaching out to both Eric and I, and we were both inspired and heartened and grateful that you liked it so much. If you haven't heard it, I highly recommend you go listen to that bonus episode that dropped yesterday or over the weekend. Can't do it without your support, without your help, without your ideas. Standupwithpete@gmail.com for any of that. And, of course, please subscribe if you haven't yet with a paid subscription. Can't do the show without your paid subscription. So please sign up now, standupwithpete.com. So, yeah, the headlines were dominated by the aftermath of the video of Tyre Nichols being released on Friday night. Of course, before that, on the same day, we saw that horrific video of Paul Pelosi being beaten with a hammer. I did watch that one. That was a huge mistake. I highly recommend you don't watch that. It's just a snuff film. It's just disgusting. But the headlines regarding Tyre Nichols, his GoFundMe page has passed $1 million that was set up for his family, and the cops that beat him are going to be arraigned. Overwhelmingly peaceful protests around the country over the weekend, and so much more that I'm sure we're going to learn about this specific case as so many are unfolding that aren't caught on camera, that aren't reported. And obviously, we've got to do something radical to reform law enforcement in this country, but we don't see that coming anytime soon in most precincts, in most states, certainly at the congressional level with the leadership that's currently in charge in the House, and even when Democrats were in charge. And President Biden hasn't been exactly touting police reform, though he has voiced support for the George Floyd Act, which a lot of experts that I read and trust argue doesn't go far enough. And I will give you a couple of those experts just quickly here before I get to my interview. I thought this was really good from, I think, Friday night on Joy Reid's show, Brittany Packnett and Joy Reid talking, and really passionate. And I just love this.
What is it that the community, when you talk to folks, what do they want? So I want to back up for a second, Joy, because I feel myself getting hot, if I'm honest. And respectfully to the other guests, I heard the word control quite a bit. And therein lies the problem. Because if we're talking about the ways to properly control a black body, we're not actually identifying the fact that the problem is that you want to control the black body in the first place. This is not about safety. This is not about public safety. That's not about serving and protecting. We're talking about a traffic stop. So the idea that there is a proper way to control a 150-pound person who is now dead is actually deeply offensive to me. The fact of the matter is people want safety. People want us to invest our money in the things that truly keep us safe. And I'm sorry, if we keep talking about training, millions, billions of dollars have been poured into training. And I say this as someone who used to advocate for these things. But I'm reminded of James Baldwin in this moment. How long do you want us to wait for your progress? Gentlemen, how long do you want us to wait for your progress? You are telling me that more training is the answer. There's been more training. There have been body cameras. There's been recruitment. There's been additional diversity. There's been money and resources poured into all of these things instead of the things that we criminalize people for, like substance abuse, like mental health, like houselessness. How long do you want us to wait for your progress? Because right now, this is certainly not what the people want. And we're tired of continuously being told to wait in order to achieve and experience the kind of personal safety and respect and dignity that we deserve.
Hooey! Excellent. What a tear. Brittany Packnett-Cunningham, activist. I always love hearing, reading, and listening to her. And also, Jelani Cobb, who is a historian, he was on with my friend Ali Velshi. This is also Friday night, and I thought this was a pretty good exchange as well.
Done this a lot. As we were playing that video, it's very, very, very difficult to watch this. In fact, I've got people sort of tweeting saying, I'm a mother, I can't watch this. But that is the bearing of witness of what happens.
I mean, I think that's a wise decision. How many of these videos have we seen?
Yeah.
And just, personally, between the two of us and millions of people watching, how many weeks and months afterward do those videos ricochet around in your head at random points? How haunting is that? And we relive this spectacle. Now, what is shocking, to the extent that anything so routine in this country can be shocking, is the fact that we see this and have the emotional reaction that we have, and yet institutionally, that seems to have no weight in preventing these actions from repeating themselves.
Right. You would think, what Alex Wagner was saying is this happened faster. The charges came faster. The police were fired relatively quickly, but it happened.
But this is the problem with that, right? I would like to think that that's progress. And maybe I'm being cynical. But it also is self-preservation.
Right.
People understand that is that horrific length of time between an incident and there being any sort of consequences for it where public tensions amp up. And that's where you wind up with things spilling over into violence, right, where you wind up with protests happening in other cities nationwide. So people have mastered the protocols of how to respond to an incident like this. They can't seem to master the protocols
of not having them happen.
Not having them happen in the first place.
Well, there you go. Not having them happen in the first place. Well said. Okay. Well, thought those were both good and just wanted to toss them in here before my conversation with Kidada Williams, I think is so good, so important, and I'm really happy to have her. Now, I should say we actually talked before the video of the beating of Tyree Nichols came out, and so she did comment on police brutality and death against black folks throughout history, of course, but this interview, just to be clear, happened the day before, I think, that video came out. All right, now, here we go. From groundbreaking scholar, a heart-wrenching re-examination of the struggle for survival in the Reconstruction era South and what it cost. The story of Reconstruction is often told from the perspective of the politicians, generals, and journalists whose accounts claim an outsized place in collective memory, but this pivotal era looked very different to African Americans in the South transitioning from bondage to freedom after 1865. Of course, that's me reading a little bit of the description of the book, which is so important. Like I said, she's an associate professor of history at Wayne State University, the author of They Left Great Marks on Me, co-author of the Charleston Syllabus, and creator of the podcast Seizing Freedom. I'm very excited to welcome Kidada Williams here for the first time. I hope you will go welcome her to the show and to the stand-up community like you have so many other great guests that have joined us over the years. You can do that on Twitter at Kidada E. Williams, or look her up and contact her. Thank her for joining us. I have her read from the book a little bit. I think you're really going to like it. Let's do it right now. For the first time on the show, Kidada Williams. Okay, I've just told you all about her, and I'm so excited. Here it is. I'm holding it up. Congratulations on the release of your second book now. I'm so excited to welcome you to Stand Up for the first time. Professor Kidada Williams, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's such a great pleasure to be here.
I am really, really just so enlightened by your work and preparing to talk to you and reading the book. It's just so imperative, your work, and I really can't say enough good things about it, and so many others have as well. But before we get into the specifics about this very impactful and important book, who are you? How did you come to this work? This little girl grows up where, and she attends, at what point do you become interested in history, in the specifics that you eventually become a scholar, and now you're this academic and author? I mean, how did you arrive at this point in life? Tell us.
Well, I'm from West Michigan. I grew up playing in Lake Michigan every day during the summer. And I came from a very history curious family. My mom was my first historian. And so, I just loved the subject. And when I got to college, I was sitting in a history class and I heard this story about this horrific lynching of a woman named Mary Turner in 1918. And I wanted to know how her family lived with what happened. Not just the fact of the killing, but how they lived in this world after something that horrific happened. And that got me interested in the subject. And historians, they were talking about the fact that there were victims, but they really weren't expressing the kind of interest in them that I feel like I've brought to the table. And so I just kept studying it, and it just stuck with me. It's something that I just can't let go. I feel like I have a debt to them, to survivors who were dismissed by a lot of people, including the federal government at the time. And so I've committed myself to understanding what surviving violence looks like.
Well, I am not the person to decide, and this is insulting, but debt paid, according to this book, because you just bring so many voices that the reader, that we can bring back to life. These people. I mean, that's what you're doing with this book. So it's a wonderful, debt that you are repaying, and however you want to phrase it. But wait, were you like a nerdy child? Were you in some kind of nerddom? I mean, who becomes really fascinated with history? How much of it was as a result of kind of seeing yourself in history?
Well, first, I was a total nerd. Yeah. Band nerd, too.
Band?
Right? I was in band. Total nerd, honor society. I read a lot of books. And so, it was seeing myself in the history. And to be honest, I think, my mom and family, they thought I was going to go sort of like pre-law and politics and English. But the Gulf War is what kind of got me interested in the past, like watching bombs over Baghdad and the reporting. And I wanted to sort of look back in time and learn more about what happened. And so, I started to pivot. This was, in high school. I started to do that pivot, and I just stuck with history from that point forward.
Yeah, it's so inappropriate to ask your age, but using the Gulf War as the thing, I kind of feel like we're around the same age, but I also felt like you were younger than me just based on whatever else.
I'm 48.
I'm 47.
Okay, so about the same time. And so watching Bernie Shaw reporting on a regular basis about what was happening, I was curious about the history of the region. And my teacher, I went to one of my teachers and I said I was curious, and she gave me a book. And so I started reading and I was enthralled, and I said, okay, I want to do more of this. And so that's how I committed myself to doing it.
Books played such an important part in your life. Just kind of a parenting question as the father of daughters now 15 and 18. They love books. Screens have come into their life in a huge way. But like anything that your parents did
to, you mentioned your mom obviously a couple times in terms of, but like, did they put the books in front of you? How did you get turned on to reading? Was it a parenting thing? Did they surround you with books? What was it?
They surrounded me with books on a regular basis, and satisfied my curiosity. We went to the used bookstore where you could get 12 books for $1 or 15 books for $1. And my mother and my dad would just sort of let me have at it, right? I would go in and, maybe I'd come away with 24 books. And I would just read and read and read. And they nurtured that. They supported it. They gave me the quiet space that I wanted. It's like, no, I don't want to watch TV. I want to read this book. And they supported that. And they were also readers themselves. So I think that makes a difference. Like, are you a reader? Because your kids will often pick up on the kinds of things that you're interested in.
I knew that was true. I'd read that a lot. So what I would always do is I'd plop myself in front of them with a book and I would have it open, but I'd have an iPad inside watching YouTube.
But eventually they catch on. Right?
They figured it out, and it was really humiliating for me. They're like, all these years, you've just been watching old MacGyver? Anyway.
The betrayal.
No, it's right, and it sounds like it worked in your case. Yeah. Before we get into the specifics, of I Saw Death Coming, which is so important, I just wanted to ask you a question that's kind of obviously topical, and so important, almost nothing more important along these lines of how history and what history should be taught in our schools. You're right. Very, very obviously cognizant of the fights that are happening throughout our country. But most recently, it got a lot of attention in Florida, although I should say it's happening at Board of Education meetings, including my own district, throughout the country each and every day. There is a real campaign to ban books and to ban a certain type of history. Your book, I imagine, would be on that list of books to not be taught. I Saw Death Coming, about the truth about Reconstruction, a history of terror and survival in the war against Reconstruction. And I just wanted to get your general thoughts on why it is so important for people of a certain age to learn a certain interpretation of history that they maybe aren't learning or haven't learned, as so many Americans, including myself, didn't.
Well, I believe it's important for young people to learn this history in large part because they believe in justice, right? And they're committed to fairness, even in their young little hearts. And when they hear about the times where we have not lived up to our ideals, when we have not lived up to our principles, they want to make it right. And so what we see in the larger society with these, what I call white comfort bills, which frustrates people, but that's
what is it? White comfort bill?
White comfort bills.
Oh, the bills, the legislation. Yeah. I thought you meant the kind of towns that a lot of us live in.
No. Well, but but a lot of these bills are about white comfort.
Yes.
Right. So that they don't pay particular attention to all of the ways that Black and brown and other marginalized kids feel in classrooms, and about the histories that they're learning. Very problematic, often distorted histories. Every fall, some teacher deigns upon her or himself to put a child in the slave trade as a course sort of reenactment, as an exercise, without thinking about that child's well-being, right? Now, they would never do that in a whole bunch of other circumstances, but they would do that in this situation. Yeah. So part of it is that you've got the distortion of the history. The other part of it is when you have people pressing for the accurate history to be taught. The people who don't really believe in liberty, freedom, and justice don't want that history taught because they know their children. They know their children believe in justice, right? And they might grow up to build a more just world. And they want to make sure that doesn't happen.
Oh, well said. So well said. And
I think we need clarity on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, idea of white comfort is that those two words are really telling in what a way to describe it, but it's preposterous simply because even if you don't talk about white comfort, it's school learning things is often and should be uncomfortable. That's what education is, especially arguably if you've had a pretty comfortable life, because it creates empathy, it creates understanding. But the idea that your child is uncomfortable, I mean, listening to that argument has been exhausting to me, because I've said to parents, like, if your kid's uncomfortable, that's a parenting thing. Like, right. Like it's not a school thing. But I just wanted to, I guess, add my commentary to that preposterous notion of needing to have your child be comfortable while learning. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah. And like I said, I think the issue is whose comfort is being paid attention to.
Yeah.
Right? Because when you've got histories that ignore Black and brown people and other marginalized people, when you have those histories that distort, like we're the same age. So I remember like there was slavery and celebrate Harriet Tubman. And at the end of the chapter, it was see Martin Luther King Jr., right? So that's all we got, right? That's all we got in most of our K through 12 education. And so there's an absence. There's a gap there, and a gap that, in my case, as an African-American child in West Michigan with a history curious family, I knew that my story I knew that Black people's history was not being covered. But I didn't really have the language to articulate, to understand why, and to articulate my feelings about it. And so, my comfort in the classroom was not something that teachers cared about.
Of course, well, yeah, of course not. But it's, again, I think we're leaving out the other obvious point, which is the idea that you would be uncomfortable from something you learn, right, and wanting to change that paradigm is preposterous. But it's also just unbelievably ignorant to not imagine that the Black kid or some other marginalized crew, any kid in that class that for whatever reasons being bullied, they're uncomfortable now because you just said some shit in the hallway. Like they're uncomfortable now about what's happening in the school, in their life, in their community right now. And you're saying you're uncomfortable about learning about something that happened hundreds of years ago. It is an absolute, I'm sorry, I'm getting worked up.
It is preposterous, but I think what we have to be clear on is we have to move past the outrage to understand like what they're actually trying to do and why.
Yeah.
And so it's an effort to sort of shut down opportunities to build a more just world. And if you understand that that's why they're doing it, then you can figure out a better way to fight for it. Is it outrageous? Yes, it's outrageous. But, so we need the sort of cooler heads to prevail to sort of get in there to say, this is what their end goal is.
It's funny that you're saying that to me. Because one of the issues I have, period, as a person is I get very emotional, and I have gotten emotional at board meetings. I've gotten emotional on the show. And it's bad. It's not really helping. It feels good in a moment, and then I look back at it and I'm like, ooh, didn't help. And the point is the fact that I can't control my emotions says so much more about me than people who are dealing with real discrimination, or the history of. I mean, reading your book just made me so angry and outraged and animated, as it should.
And don't get me wrong, I'm angry and outraged, but I'm cool-headed. Like I am cool-headed because I know that they want me to focus on my outrage. And while I'm outraged, I'm not sort of paying attention to what they're doing and calling it out and organizing people to fight for justice. And so I have my moments, I deal with it, but then I come right back to, and that's what frustrates people. Because I understand exactly the end goal.
Yes, and your ability to mostly control your emotions is quite an inspiration for someone like me that just needs to do it a lot more to be, as you're saying, and as many have said before us, effective. To be effective is to be, in this case, mature, cool-headed, clear-thinking, as you obviously have been able to do throughout your career. Although I would like to see some video of you getting upset. It would be really.
You should ask my students.
Well, I would love to interview them. Okay, so real quick.
They regularly ask, they're like, is she going to flip a table?
Well, listen, you have depending
on the issue, they're like, she might flip a table.
I'm not sure of your tenure status, but I'd be flipping tables. I'm just talking about job security here.
Oh, yeah, I'm tenured.
Let's flip some tables then.
In that respect, I'm set, but that's why my students are like, is she going to flip a table over this issue that we just told her about?
What I do think is What I think it's too far that you've done is you've built like fake tables that are very light. So when you flip them, they look like they're doing a lot more damage than an actual real. You're using prop tables, I think, is too much, Kidada. All right. I mean, ridiculous. Before we get to your new book, would you just mind telling me about your first book? Is it your first book? They Left Great Marks on Me. What was that about?
Yes. So my first book looked at African Americans' wide-ranging testimonies about racist violence. So you've got the testimonies that people give before the Klan hearings, but African Americans write a lot of letters about lynching to the federal government, to members of the NAACP. They're writing the Department of Justice. They're writing the presidents of the United States. And what they're trying to do is convey the harm of the violence so they can get federal officials to enforce the 14th Amendment. And so the book sort of tells that story of African Americans trying to organize what will become later on the civil rights movement. But their first campaign is to try to address lynching in the late 19th and early 20th century. So I tell that story using testimonies of survivors and their relatives.
Testimonies are central to your scholarship in both of these books, and I just had no idea that there were so many accounts. I suppose should have, but who was looking at them? Well, you were, I suppose, many nights in libraries or wherever you work, looking and reading and researching and putting them all into your books and into your work in a way that just spins this, can I say, narrative that is so readable and educational and inspiring, and as I already mentioned, enraging, obviously. Would you mind, if as I've asked you, let's not act like I didn't, to read a selection from your book to get us into this, which I saw you read this at Politics and Prose on YouTube, and I was like, oh man, I think it's a really great way to get us into a specific story of a specific person.
Okay, so I am ready.
Okay.
On a November night in 1871, just outside of Aberdeen, Mississippi, Edward Crosby stepped outside to get some water for his thirsty child. Suddenly, he heard and felt the thunder of a team of horses. He gazed out and saw about 30 disguised men descending on his home. Their mounts were draped by full-bodied cloth coverings. Mrs. Crosby, who must have seen or heard the men approaching too, asked Edward who and what they were. Edward had heard stories about armed white men on horseback galloping through the countryside and torturing and murdering Black families in the middle of the night during recent elections. Extremists and their apologists often refer to these raids euphemistically as visits, masking their brutality behind the veneer of a friendly social call. Edward told his wife he reckoned the gang headed for them was what people in their community called Ku Klux, shorthand for the Ku Klux Klan. Do you want me to sort of wrap up there?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, yeah. I could listen to you read the whole... Is there an audiobook?
So there will be an audiobook. It's coming out mid-spring. And so like the story of Edward Crosby, like the men come for him and he's able to survive the attack by running and hiding in his smokehouse, in his family's smokehouse, hoping that the men won't think to look there, and they don't. And so the men eventually leave and no one is harmed, but they live in fear of being visited again. And so that's one of the reasons why Edward testifies, and because he understands how lucky he is. The story that I told at Politics and Prose ends very differently with the death of the family's patriarch. And so like I use those stories to tell a new history of the Civil War and Reconstruction and reframe our understandings of what actually happened. And you so do. And my turn. Let me just read again. This is picking up on the same gentleman, Edward. You write, Edward and other voters went to the polls hoping to lift their preferred candidates to victory. About what year is this then? Actually, this is about 1871. They were part of a larger contingent of Black people working to make freedom real. Many of them had resisted or escaped slavery during the Civil War. These Americans, the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment were the first steps on the road to freedom, not the last. Freedom wasn't just about legal equality or the vote for them. It was about family and community. The franchise was a means to help Black families and communities achieve their goal, the end of any oppressive systems and practices that denied them their right to be free, equal, and secure. And it's just, you make this point in different ways about how the right to vote is important, but it's also important to live and to have your family live. And so many people lost their partners, their spouses, their children. And was that worth it to go out and put themselves on the line, and including with these testimonies or reporting these horrible what are they called? Visits? Night riders. I mean, I'm sorry, I didn't end with a question. Do you want to pick up on any of that? Yeah, for a lot of them, they wanted to vote because they believed that that was the best way to protect their families and to protect all of their freedom, all of the new rights they acquire after the Civil War. And for some of the men, it's not worth it. They testify. And I feel like what historians often use these accounts for is to establish the fact of election violence and the fact that the violence played a role in disfranchising Black male voters during the Civil War. But what the men themselves say is that, yes, I lost the right to vote. I may be losing the right to vote, but I lost my child. Yeah. And that matters more to me than the vote. You think this is about political violence. And yes, political violence is what brought them to my house. But the most devastating thing of all is losing my child or losing my wife or losing my father in this violence.
Those of us who have even a mediocre elementary understanding of history, particularly this short period that was one of the most consequential of our time of Reconstruction, might not still understand how widespread and what specifically the violence created. And that's what your book does. I think in many different ways. So how widespread was this violence? You even, I think, at the beginning of the book, you have a map of where these kinds of things were occurring. How widespread was it? And then we can kind of talk about the obvious impacts, right, or not obvious.
So it's very widespread. Across the entire region, you've got different types of violence. Night riding isn't something that's happening everywhere in every single community, but it's happening in a lot of communities. Like so widespread that, you've got U.S. Army reports, you've got Freedmen's Bureau reports, you've got members of Congress hearing about it, you've got newspapers reporting on it. So it's very widespread, and it's over the history of Reconstruction. So we're talking about these mass killing events that are happening each year in communities across the region through the 1880s, easily.
It's probably a fool's errand to try to, for historians or others to try to, just pontificate of what would have happened had Abraham Lincoln not been assassinated or any other period in history, and let Hollywood try to do that. But it does, in reading the book, I couldn't help but think about Abraham Lincoln being assassinated, and the guy who replaces him is so much different and so antithetical, Andrew Johnson. But yet, in reading your book, it's still like he did, in 1860, what year was it here? He sent a U.S. Army general named Carl Schurz, you write, down to tell him what's going on down there. How bad is it? And I just thought that, and then later on, General Thomas Kilby Smith, who both these names I learned for the first time, as well as so many others, like they reported on the conditions there, and then later in Texas. And what did they report back? Because I don't remember learning about these generals that have been dispatched to come back with a report for the president or the Congress.
Right. So that, what Johnson learns is that, I think one person refers to the ex-Confederates as lip loyal. So they say one thing, but they mean another. And it's very clear to anyone who's paying attention that the former enslavers are they are mad about emancipation. They are not easily letting go of the people they held in bondage. And so you've got a lot of violence, and everyone knows about it. So this violence is not secret. It's not as though people don't know. President Johnson is fully aware of it. But like many people who actually don't care about Black people, he just didn't care. He said, this is made up, or it can't be that bad, even when he's hearing this from his own generals.
So many of these emancipated slaves, they stay and work in the South, but because of the power paradigms that are created, even apparently where they were the majority of people, sometimes they had to work and live on farms they might have even been enslaved on. Either way, they became sharecroppers, and it's basically kind of a quasi serfdom. And the boss, the white guy in charge, it says, don't go vote. Don't go thinking you're going to go voting. You write about specific testimonials here. Give us some of those stories about what their lives were like and how they were threatened if they voted. And, there's so much of that in this book. So important.
So they are told not to vote, or they're told to vote for the Democratic ticket. And if they don't, there'll be a price to pay. But the voters themselves realize that if they vote the way the people who held them in bondage are telling them to vote, then they're never going to get off from under that control. And so they do their best. They will go and they will try to vote for people they want to vote for. But Edward Crosby, when he went to vote, he was denied a ballot. And he went to another polling place to get another ballot. And he was told there are no ballots available. And so he just goes home and he says, I was beat. And then he was visited afterwards. But other people, what they are experiencing, he was visited.
Well,
afterwards.
You just kind of went over that. I mean, just to be clear, that's what you were reading earlier. He was, after he went to vote, he was terrorized by a group of terrorists. His family was terrorized in the middle of the night.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's what happened to so many of the men who voted, who defied white supremacy during that time period. Right. Edward, he managed to save his life, but other people, they weren't as lucky. They died in attacks, in those retaliatory attacks for their decision to vote.
Professor, you talk about the history that's been written. You mentioned, white professional historians like William Dunning affirming this narrative that was wrong, that portrayed the Reconstruction era as a tragic one of misrule caused by the supposedly misguided decision to enfranchise black men. And of course, you refer to W.E.B. Du Bois and his book, Black Reconstruction, which I guess is one of probably the most important at the time written, if not ever. But I think you make a really good an important point a couple times, and in most of what I've heard you give in interviews that I think is very, very important. You write, in recent years, other historians have unintentionally, you're very generous, amplified the, quote, lost cause narrative by using the language of failure as a shorthand for what the historical records reveal. Federal officials, quote, failed to aid freed people's hunger for self-sufficiency and self-determination, failed to redistribute land, failed to enforce black people's civil and political rights. Your point being that this is the wrong narrative to be teaching anybody. Black Americans like Edward Crosby, the narrative they told about Reconstruction, it did not simply fail. White conservatives overthrew it. So this explain why that matters so much. The narrative that, certainly that you and other historians are trying to tell.
Right. So the argument that Reconstruction failed is part of the lost cause narrative. So the lost cause narrative being that narrative that ex-Confederates created to justify why they lost the Civil War. So they go through and they rewrite the history of the war and they say, the war wasn't about slavery. It was about states' rights and all of the rest of the stuff. But they add on to it with Reconstruction and they say Reconstruction failed. They said black people were freed from slavery. They were given every possible opportunity to succeed. They got the vote and equal rights and all of these things, and they failed to make the most of it. So that was a story that they told. And it went right alongside with the Civil War being about states' rights and having nothing to do with slavery. So this is the big lie of the 19th century.
Well said.
Yes. Of the 19th century. But this argument that Reconstruction failed is part of that, right? And so a lot of people grew up hearing it. And when you talk to young people today about what they learned about Reconstruction, they say, well, it failed. And when you press them on what failed, they can't tell you what failed. Or they won't tell you what failed, depending on where they went to school. And so, what I realized with listening to the audience, listening to people, what I heard was that historians have been using this shorthand. And what they mean is when historians today use it, what they're saying is that the federal government failed, but they're not saying explicitly that the federal government failed. They will use a shorthand and say Reconstruction failed. And it's like, no. You're feeding into the problematic narrative by not saying who failed to do what. And what people are doing is they're taking that silence and they're filling in the blanks. And some of those blanks that they're filling in are those stories that they heard in K through 12, which is that Reconstruction failed because black people failed to make the most of it. So I argue we need to let that narrative go. And if we're talking about who failed, we need to say exactly who failed. But we also need to acknowledge that Reconstruction was violently overthrown and abandoned. That's the other part of the story, so. Abandon
is a huge part of the story. You write, Reconstruction is one of the most significant eras in American history, but black people's experiences in this era are among the most misunderstood and misrepresented aspects of the story. You kind of just said that, but later on you say, survivors' searing recollections of the war after the Civil War bring to light the ways that Reconstruction did not fail, but was violently overthrown. And I can't help but think, and if you write this, maybe I missed it or I didn't pick up on it, that the other thing it contributes is to a narrative that when black people try to get ahead, fight back against white supremacy, they almost always fail. So don't try. Like, is there, I think that's probably, there's some truth to try to create intimidation against future efforts, because you could try as hard as you want, but you're just going to be targeted, minimized, marginalized more than you already are.
Exactly. And so that's what white supremacists want. Yeah. But that's not what happens, right? So, they are able to establish the system of racist apartheid So they are able to get that up, but that's simply because they have like a sort of like a majority throughout the South. And because of the rest of the rest of white Americans let them do that. So Reconstruction is overthrown and abandoned, but that abandonment comes through from white Northerners and Westerners who don't use their power to hold white Southerners accountable. So I think that that's really important, but Black people never forgot the history of Reconstruction. They passed down those stories from generation to generation to inspire their children and grandchildren to fight for the freedoms that they were entitled to. So we've got the sort of what white supremacists want, which is for Black people to give it up. And we've got Black people's steadfast determination to stand in the truth and to, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, make the nation, provide what it put on paper, to make good on the promises of the founding, to make good on the promises of the American Revolution. And so, you've got the violence, and Black people have been steadfast in their refusal, to accept that they are supposed to have a subjugated place in American society, that they're not entitled to a piece of the American pie.
There's so much more to this history, to this and to this book, and I'm barely, touching it. But I think that I guess I just want to say that some people might hear about your book. I mean, literally, a publisher might not want to publish this book because, it's depressing. A reader might not want to read the book because it's sad or depressing. And I think that that's a real big problem. Or a person like me might not want to interview you because who's going to want to listen to this interview? Will I be able to sell, more subscriptions or ads, even though I'm not doing ads right now? And I wonder what I know what your answer is because you write the answer to that question. What do you say to people, whether it be publishers, podcasters, or corporate media, students or readers who might be like, I don't want to read this?
Well, I think I would say it's, I would answer as an African American in a context where Black people are being killed by vigilantes and unarmed Black men, for the most part, are being killed by police. And so I would say, as a Black person, I don't have the luxury of saying that this history is too difficult because I live in the future created by it. And I think we all live in the future created by it. And if we say that we believe in liberty, freedom, and justice, then we might do well to learn from what actually happened in the past, and we might stop the violence that's happening today. Clearly, we haven't learned because the violence is still occurring.
Sometimes I wonder if we in the media, at least publicly, we focus too much on death as a result of law enforcement. And I mean, listen, how do you decide how much you're supposed to focus on someone's death
Right.
and injustice? But my point is that we don't focus enough on the terror created in communities throughout history from law enforcement. And when you talk about Mr. Crosby and the white vigilante gangs, the night raids that they launched, like in his case, he survives the first night. But how do you sleep the next night? How do you live? How do you not live your life looking over your shoulder? What kind of life is that? So we talk about actual violence a lot, as we should, death, obviously, the most. But I feel like we don't talk enough about how these structures and these systems create daily terror for Black lives in America today. And so pick up on that, because I know that you recognize fully the world that we're in today. And I know that you also say history says that we're going to be here for a long time. My question is, where are we in America today? And and is there light at the end of people's different tunnels?
Well, I can't be your hope whisperer, but I will come back to that. But I'll get started by saying, by taking the question seriously. I think where we are in the United States today is that we have good reason to be afraid of going in public places, because we never know when there's going to be a mass shooter, right? I think that Black and brown people being targeted by vigilantes is a reality. I think that with police killings, when I see lights and sirens, my heart stops, right? That is the reality that we live in. Some of us, may be in a position of comfort where we don't have to think that way, but a lot of us actually do. We don't have the luxury to not think that. So we do need to be aware of that. And as long as people are in denial about that reality, as long as they're willing to whistle past it and say, well, let's focus on the happy things, we're going to stay in this place and we're not going to build a better world. And that is what concerns me, if I'm honest.
How do well-meaning folks who are not Black make a better world? What are some of the things that you see people doing that you think are effective, and maybe, I would argue sometimes unintentionally ineffective?
I think one of the things to be more effective is work on people who are in those all white spaces that Black and brown people don't have access to. Fight for justice in those circles too, making the case in those spaces, just as you make the case in sort of like mixed race company. Do that work, because that's where the hard work is. And when I talk to people about it, they're like, well, that's hard. Well, living in the reality of this violence is hard too. But we're going to stay here unless we get more people who are actually, actively involved in that fight and willing to have those hard conversations with the people who enable the system to continue.
I got to wrap it up, and I appreciate your time, and I'm not sure that I've done enough justice to the book itself. I certainly think that this is a great introduction to you and your work. Is there anything else you want to say, a narrative or a part of the book, or an intention for writing it that you think is important, that you'd like to share about anything else that we learned? I learned so much, and I feel like, in a way, I want to, as I'm reading and preparing the interview, I'm like, I hope everybody hears what I've read and then, well, go buy the book is what I would say. But anything else?
Yeah, I think the one thing I would say is that it's a hard history, but it's also an inspiring one. Because, all of these people, they live to tell about it because they believe in justice. They went and they told their stories, they put them on record, and we honor them by knowing their stories and by trying to do something that wasn't done for them, which is build that better world.
Really appreciate you. Thank you very much for saying that, for everything. I mean, just a great talk. And I love getting to know you through my prep, but even better in this conversation. When I'm done with the book, I hope you'll come back and talk about it more, maybe even join a live hangout and let listeners, do a little book party virtually, because I guess that's how we do everything now. And if, I should say, if you're listening before, I think it was February 8th, part of your book tour is you're going to be in Ann Arbor, Michigan, at the Ann Arbor District Library. And if there's other dates, all the links in my show notes for today's episode. Professor Kidada Williams, what an honor and a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, there she goes, everybody. Kidada Williams. For the first time ever, go thank her for joining us on Twitter. Go reach out to her however you want to and let her know, welcome to the stand-up family. I was just so blown away by her knowledge and scholarship and ability to recall pretty much anything right from the top of her head, facts about the history that she teaches and writes about. Go get the book as well. I Saw Death Coming. History of terror and survival in the war against Reconstruction. Important and fascinating, and we want to support this type of author and get books like this in your libraries and to your peoples. That's all I've got for you today. Tomorrow, Jesse Gender is going to join me to talk about all kinds of trans issues. Also going to be talking to J.L. Covan, who I always look forward to talking to and hearing from, and much, much more this week. Who do you want to hear from? Email me, standupwithpete@gmail.com, or message me, or whatever, on the Twitters, or follow me on Instagram and YouTube. You can watch the full videos, full interviews of some of my interviews on youtube.com/standupwithpete. And that is it, ladies and gentlemen. John Carroll taking us out right now. Here you go, brother.
Off of your fence, even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense, and you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town, just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down, boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of a stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go. can see them flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up, stand up. Got to stand